The cold was the first thing that truly registered, a liquid cold that seeped through the denim of her jeans and into her bones. Rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets, plastering strands of her hair to her cheeks and blurring the streetlights into hazy, indifferent stars. The sound of the front door closing was a sharp, final crack in the symphony of the storm. It was followed by the metallic snick of the deadbolt, a sound so small yet so absolute it seemed to carve a hole in the night itself. Anika sat in her wheelchair on the slick, dark pavement of the driveway, the red of her shirt a bleeding wound against the monochrome of the midnight storm. The wheels of her chair were locked, a cruel, final gesture from the man who had put her there. Just moments before, his voice had been a blade, honed with a chilling calm that was far more terrifying than any shout. "I can't do this anymore, Anika," Marcus had said, his face a mask of detached resolve. "I can't be tied to this." To you, he hadn't looked at her as he said it, his eyes fixed on some point over her head, as if she were already a ghost. The words were not an argument. They were a verdict. He had rolled her through the doorway, his hands firm and impersonal on the handles of her chair, the same hands that had once held hers with what she had mistaken for tenderness. The transition from the warm, carpeted hallway to the cold, wet asphalt was a violent shock to her system. He had left her there, just beyond the threshold, a piece of discarded furniture. The rain was washing away the scent of their shared life, the faint aroma of the dinner they had eaten together just hours earlier, the lingering perfume on her scarf. It was washing away everything. A profound, hollow ache opened in her chest, an abyss of disbelief and pain so vast she felt she might fall into it forever. She did not cry. The tears felt frozen inside her, trapped behind a wall of shock. Her body, already a geography of limitations, felt impossibly heavy, anchored to the cold ground by a grief that had no name. She was 26 years old. She was paralyzed from the waist down. And she had just been thrown out of her home by the man who had vowed to cherish her in sickness and in health. The world had shrunk to the length of the driveway, the sound of the rain, and the solid, unforgiving wood of the door that would not open again. Time seemed to stretch and dissolve. A minute could have been an hour. Then, through the thick curtain of the downpour, a new light appeared. It was sharp and white, slicing through the darkness, growing brighter, closer. A pair of headlights. A long, black car glided to a stop at the end of the driveway, its engine a low, unobtrusive hum beneath the drumming of the rain. The vehicle was a silhouette of impossible wealth and power against the modest backdrop of the suburban street. For a moment, she thought it might be a dream, a hallucination born of cold and despair. But then a door opened, and a figure emerged, shielded from the storm by a wide, black umbrella held by a driver who seemed to materialize from the shadows. The figure moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, stepping into the periphery of the streetlight's glow, his presence a stark, silent intrusion into her private apocalypse. He stopped a few feet away, a man encased in a bubble of stillness, and simply looked at her, his expression unreadable in the fractured light. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the rain hammering against the taut fabric of the umbrella, a percussive rhythm that seemed to count the seconds of her humiliation. Anika could not bring herself to look up, to meet the gaze of this stranger who had stumbled upon the most desolate moment of her life. She kept her eyes fixed on her own hands, clenched tightly in her lap, the knuckles white against her dark skin. The water streamed down her face, mingling with the unshed tears, and she wondered if he could see how violently she was trembling. The silence was absolute, broken only by the storm. He did not speak. He did not ask what had happened. There was no pity in his stillness, only a profound, unsettling quiet. Then he took a step forward. The expensive leather of his shoes made no sound on the wet pavement. He gestured, a small, almost imperceptible motion of his head, and the driver who held the umbrella moved swiftly to the passenger side of the black BMW, opening the door. The man then crouched down, bringing himself closer to her level. The scent of rain, wool, and something clean and subtle, like sandalwood, reached her. "We should get you out of the storm," he said. His voice was low and even, without inflection, yet it carried a weight that commanded attention. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Anika finally lifted her head, her gaze meeting his. His face was angular, his eyes dark and deep-set, holding an intensity that was both unnerving and strangely calming. There was no judgment there, only a quiet assessment of the situation. She tried to speak, to form a word, a protest, anything, but her throat was tight with cold and grief. A choked sound was all that escaped. He seemed to understand. He nodded once, then turned to his driver and spoke in a language she did not recognize, the words clipped and soft. The driver returned, and together, with a practiced and surprisingly gentle efficiency, they maneuvered her from her wheelchair into the warm, cavernous interior of the car. The leather seats were soft and smelled of wealth. The moment the door closed, the roar of the storm was reduced to a distant, muted drumming. The sudden warmth and silence were a shock, a sensory cocoon that made the cold she had just endured feel even more brutal in retrospect. The driver folded her wheelchair and placed it in the trunk. The man settled into the seat beside her, a silent, imposing presence. He draped a thick wool blanket, which had been resting on the seat, over her legs and torso. The fabric was heavy and comforting, a small anchor in the swirling chaos of her mind. The car pulled away from the curb, the motion so smooth it was almost imperceptible. Anika watched the house, her house, recede through the rain-streaked window until it was swallowed by the darkness. It was a place that had held every dream she had ever built, and now it was just a shape in the night, a tomb of a life that was no longer hers. She didn't know who this man was or where he was taking her. A tremor of fear, sharp and clear, finally cut through the fog of her shock. But as she glanced at the man beside her, at his calm profile illuminated by the passing streetlights, another feeling surfaced alongside the fear, a fragile, inexplicable sense of safety. He had offered her shelter from a storm, both the one raging outside and the one that had just torn her world apart. For now, in the warm, quiet dark of his car, that was enough. She must have fallen asleep, or perhaps drifted into a state of shock-induced unconsciousness, because the next thing she knew, the car was no longer moving. The engine was off. The world outside the windows was a deep, pre-dawn gray, the rain having softened to a gentle, persistent drizzle. She was in an underground parking garage, the air still and cool. The man, Jinwoo, as she would later learn he was called, was not in the car. The door beside her opened, and a woman with kind eyes and hair streaked with silver stood there. She was older, dressed in simple, elegant gray trousers and a soft white blouse. She smiled a small, reassuring smile. "My name is Mrs. Kim," she said, her voice gentle. "Please, allow me to help you." Anika, disoriented and stiff, could only nod. With the help of the same silent driver, she was transferred back into her own wheelchair, which was now dry and clean. They entered an elevator that ascended in a smooth, silent rush, opening directly into a sprawling apartment that seemed to float above the city. The floors were a pale, polished wood. The walls were adorned with minimalist art, and floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic view of the city awakening under a bruised purple sky. Mrs. Kim guided her down a long, quiet hallway to a room. The bed was enormous, dressed in crisp white linens, and a soft light emanated from a bedside lamp. A set of dry clothes, a simple cotton nightgown, was laid out on a chair. Mrs. Kim helped her change with a practiced, respectful touch that asked for nothing and offered only comfort. She said little, understanding that words were likely an intrusion Anika could not bear. Once Anika was settled in the bed, the blankets pulled up to her chin, Mrs. Kim placed a glass of water on the nightstand. "Rest now," she whispered, before slipping out of the room and closing the door with a soft click. Anika was left alone in the stillness. The silence was profound, a stark contrast to the emotional violence of the night. Here, there was no rain, no cruel words, no locked door. There was only the low hum of the city far below and the steady, even rhythm of her own breathing. She lay there, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling, and the full weight of her reality began to sink in. Marcus was gone. Her home was gone. The life she knew, the future she had so carefully imagined, had been obliterated in a single, brutal act. The tears that had been frozen inside her finally began to thaw. They came not in a storm, but in a silent, steady stream, soaking the pillow beneath her head. They were tears of grief for her marriage, tears of terror for her future, and tears of a deep, sorrowful confusion.
Why?
The question echoed in the silent chamber of her heart, a relentless, painful beat. Why had he done it? What had she missed? She replayed their last weeks together, searching for a sign, a warning, but found only the mundane tapestry of a shared life that had seemed, if not perfect, then at least stable. The stillness of the room was a merciless canvas, and on it, her mind painted every memory, every shared laugh, every quiet moment, and tainted it with the poison of his final act. The sun rose, casting long, pale fingers of light across the wooden floor, but in the quiet, luxurious room, Anika felt as if she were still trapped in the darkest part of the night. Days blurred into a single, monotonous stretch of quiet grief. Anika spent most of her time in the room, either in the bed or sitting in her wheelchair by the vast window, watching the city live and breathe a world away. Mrs. Kim was a constant, gentle presence. She brought trays of food, simple, nourishing meals like warm broth, steamed fish, and rice, and would sit quietly in the room while Anika ate, her silent companionship a strange sort of comfort. She never pushed, never pried. She would simply tidy the room, draw a warm bath, or refill the glass of water on the nightstand, her movements efficient and soothing. Anika learned the rhythm of the apartment through sound, the soft slide of a door, the distant clink of cutlery, the low murmur of Mrs. Kim speaking on the phone in the kitchen. Of the man, Jin-woo, she saw nothing. He was a ghost in his own home, his presence felt only in the seamless comfort and absolute security that surrounded her. She knew he was there, somewhere in another part of the vast, quiet space, but he granted her an inviolable privacy. It was a strange sort of debt she was accumulating, a debt of kindness to a man she did not know, a man who had plucked her from the ruin of her life for reasons she could not begin to fathom. On the fourth day, as the afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow on the city below, there was a soft knock on her door. It wasn't Mrs. Kim's familiar rap. Anika's heart gave a small, nervous flutter. "Come in," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. The door opened and Jin-woo entered. He was dressed in a simple dark sweater and trousers, looking less like the imposing figure from the rainy night and more like a scholar or an artist. He held 2 mugs in his hands, steam rising from them in fragrant wisps. He offered one to her. "Green tea," he said, his voice as calm and steady as she remembered. She took it, her fingers wrapping around the warm ceramic. He pulled a chair over to the window and sat, not opposite her, but beside her, so they were both looking out at the skyline. They sat in silence for a long time, sipping the tea. The quiet was not awkward, it was meditative. It was as if he understood that she was not ready for a barrage of questions. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and direct. "I know your husband, Anika." The sound of her name on his lips was startling. She turned to look at him, her breath catching in her throat. His expression was serious, his dark eyes holding hers with an unwavering intensity. "Marcus was involved in a business venture with some of my associates. A venture that required a significant investment from him." He paused, letting the words settle. "He made promises he could not keep. He used funds that were not his to use. He accrued a very large debt, a debt he had no means of repaying." The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture that was uglier and colder than she could have imagined. Her confusion, the agonizing why that had haunted her, was beginning to find a horrifying answer. "He was supposed to meet with me that night," Jin-woo continued, his gaze returning to the window, "to discuss a final arrangement. He never showed up. Instead, he emptied your joint accounts, gathered whatever cash he could, and disappeared. Leaving you was not just an act of cruelty. It was a diversion, a desperate, cowardly attempt to shed every liability before he ran. The truth was a physical blow. It knocked the air from her lungs. The betrayal was no longer a mystery of the heart, a simple, tragic falling out of love. It was a business transaction. She had been liquidated, written off as a bad asset. Her paralysis, her dependence, her love, he had bundled it all up and discarded it like trash because it was inconvenient to his escape. The pain was immense, but it was a different kind of pain. It was sharp and clean, a surgeon's cut rather than a festering wound. It was the pain of knowing, not the agony of guessing. Marcus had not thrown her away because he no longer loved her. He had thrown her away because he had never loved her enough to matter more than money. He had sold her future for his. The knowledge settled not as a weight, but as a cold, hard stone in the pit of her stomach. For days, she had been drowning in a sea of self-recrimination, wondering what she had done wrong, how she had failed, why she had not been enough. Jean Wu's revelation, brutal as it was also a liberation. It was not about her. It had never been about her. It was about Marcus's greed, his weakness, his profound and utter selfishness. The grief for the man she thought she had married began to curdle, solidifying into a hard, dense anger. It was not a hot, raging fire, but a cold, quiet flame, a pilot light igniting in the deepest part of her. She had survived a catastrophic accident that had taken the use of her legs. She would survive this, too. The next morning, when Mrs. Kim brought her breakfast, Anika met her eyes and spoke clearly for the first time. "Thank you, Mrs. Kim. This looks wonderful." The older woman's face broke into a warm, genuine smile. A small shift had occurred, a crack in the ice. Later that day, Anika wheeled herself out of her room and explored the apartment. It was a place of quiet, understated luxury. Every object in its place, every surface gleaming. It was beautiful but sterile, the home of a man who lived a life of discipline and control. She found the living area, a vast space with a low black sofa and a wall of books. Jean Wu was there reading. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "I need to ask you for something," Anika said, her voice steady. He closed his book, giving her his full attention. "I need to know everything, every detail of what he did. I need to see the proof." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. He seemed to see the new resolve in her, the flicker of steel that had replaced the shattered vulnerability. "There are legal documents," he said. "Bank statements. Correspondence. It will not be pleasant to see." "I don't want pleasant," she replied, her voice firm. "I want the truth." He nodded slowly. "I will have everything brought to you." The next day, a slim leather briefcase was delivered to her room. Inside were files, meticulously organized. For hours, Anika sat and read, piecing together the anatomy of Marcus's betrayal. She saw the falsified investment reports, the statements from accounts she never knew existed, the secret withdrawals from their savings that he had explained away as home repairs or car maintenance. She saw the timeline of his deceit, stretching back months, long before his final, cruel act. Each page was a fresh wound, but it was also a confirmation. It was proof that the fault was not hers. The foundation of their life together had been a lie, and the cracks had been spreading long before the house finally came down. That evening, she found Jean Wu again, this time on a wide terrace that overlooked the glittering city. The night air was cool and crisp. "He left me with nothing," she said, her voice quiet but devoid of self-pity. "He took it all, not all," Jean Wu said, looking out at the endless grid of lights. "He did not take your strength." Anika looked down at her hands, at the body that had so often felt like a prison. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of what he was talking about. Marcus had taken her money, her home, her sense of security. But the core of her, the part that had learned to navigate the world from a chair, the part that had endured pain and loss and kept going, that part was still intact. It was bruised and battered, but it was hers. "What happens now?" she asked, the question hanging in the cool night air. "Now," Jean Wu said, turning to face her, his dark eyes reflecting the city lights. "You decide." It was the most powerful thing anyone had said to her in years. The power of that choice, the agency he had returned to her, became the fulcrum on which her life began to turn. She was no longer a victim adrift in the storm. She was a survivor charting a new course. Her first decision was to reclaim her body. The accident had been a brutal, random act of fate, But Marcus's betrayal felt like a second, more deliberate violation, an assault on her very identity. She would not let it define her. She asked Jinwoo if he knew of a physical therapist. The next day, she met Dr. Lena Chen, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor and hands that seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of muscle and nerve. Dr. Chen did not speak of miraculous cures or false hope. She spoke of strength, control, and endurance. "We are not aiming to undo what happened," she said during their first session in a small, well-equipped gym within the apartment building. "We are aiming to build what is possible now. Your legs may not walk, but your arms, your core, your spirit, they will be stronger than ever before." The work was grueling. It was hours of stretching, weight training, and repetitive exercises that pushed Anika to the limits of her physical and mental stamina. There were days when her muscles screamed in protest, when frustration brought her to the brink of tears. But through it all, Jinwoo was a quiet, constant presence. He would often be there in a corner of the gym, working on his own or simply observing, his stillness a silent form of encouragement. He never offered empty platitudes, but his belief in her was a palpable force. Alongside her physical recovery, he helped her begin the legal battle. He introduced her to a formidable lawyer, a sharp, elegant woman who specialized in complex financial fraud. Together, they began building a case against Marcus, using the evidence Jinwoo had already gathered. It was not about revenge. For Anika, it was about reclamation. It was about drawing a clear, undeniable line between her life and his, legally and financially severing the ties that he had already destroyed emotionally. An unspoken alliance formed between Anika and Jinwoo. They fell into a comfortable rhythm. They would share quiet breakfasts, reading newspapers in companionable silence. In the evenings, they would often sit on the terrace, talking. She learned bits and pieces of his life, not through direct questions, which he gently deflected, but through his observations on art, history, and human nature. She sensed a deep well of solitude in him, a loneliness that mirrored her own. He ran a vast, complex organization, a world of shadows and power she did not ask about, but with her, he was simply Jinwoo, a man who offered tea and silence in equal, comforting measure. He saw past her wheelchair, past her paralysis, to the resilient core of her being. She, in turn, saw past his guarded, formidable exterior to the quiet compassion he rarely showed the world. One evening, after a particularly difficult session with Dr. Chen, Anika was exhausted and despondent, feeling as if she had made no progress. Jinwoo found her by the window, staring blankly at the rain that had begun to fall again. He didn't speak, but simply placed a small, lacquered box on the table beside her. She opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was a single, perfect gardenia, its white petals unfurling, its fragrance filling the air. "In my culture," he said softly, "the gardenia symbolizes secret love, but also purity and refinement. And resilience. It blooms even in difficult conditions." Anika looked from the flower to his face, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something vulnerable in his dark eyes, a shared understanding of pain and the will to grow beyond it. In that moment, she understood that he was not just her protector. He was becoming her partner, the first true partner she had ever had. Their bond was not forged in whispered promises and romantic declarations, but in the shared quiet of healing, in the steady, unspoken support of two lonely souls finding shelter in one another. It took 3 months for Jinwoo's network to locate Marcus. He hadn't fled the country as they had initially suspected. He was in a small, sun-bleached city on the coast, living under a different name, attempting to launder the money he had stolen into a new life. He had purchased a boat and was living a transient, unmoored existence, believing he had successfully vanished. The news of his discovery sent a jolt of cold adrenaline through Anika. The abstract legal battle was about to become terrifyingly real. Jinwoo did not ask her what she wanted to do. He simply presented her with the options, his voice a calm, steadying presence. He could handle it for her. His people could ensure the funds were recovered, that Marcus faced the consequences of his actions with the cold, impersonal efficiency of his world. Or She could face him herself. The thought was paralyzing. The image of his face on that last night, devoid of emotion, was seared into her memory. But the woman she was now was not the same one he had left broken in the rain. She had spent months rebuilding herself, physically and emotionally. Her arms were strong, her core was solid, and her spirit, while scarred, was no longer fragile. She had to do it. She had to look him in the eye and let him see that he had not destroyed her. The confrontation was arranged in a neutral, sterile space, the conference room of a law firm in the coastal city. It was a glass-walled box, impersonal and cold. Anika arrived with her lawyer and Jinwoo, who remained in the lobby, a silent guardian whose presence she could feel even through the walls. She wheeled herself to the head of the long, polished table and waited. When Marcus was escorted in, he looked different. His confidence was gone, replaced by a sallow, hunted look. He was thinner, and his eyes darted around the room, unable to meet hers. He saw her, and for a fleeting moment, a flicker of shock crossed his face. He was clearly expecting a broken, weeping victim. He was not prepared for the woman sitting before him, her posture straight, her expression composed, her red shirt a deliberate echo of the night he had abandoned her, now a color of strength, not of a wound. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice even and clear, betraying none of the turmoil raging inside her. He flinched at the sound of his real name. He started to speak, to offer some pathetic excuse, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "There is nothing for you to say," she continued. "I am not here to listen to your lies or your apologies. I am here to close this chapter." Her lawyer slid a sheaf of papers across the table. Divorce petitions. A civil suit for the recovery of stolen assets. A sworn affidavit detailing his financial fraud, ready to be submitted to the authorities. "You took what you thought was everything," Anika said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying across the silent room with devastating weight. "You were wrong. You left me with the one thing you never had. Integrity. You thought this chair made me weak. But my weakness was ever believing in a man as small and empty as you." He finally looked at her then, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He saw not the woman he had discarded, but the judge of his character, her calm gaze a more profound condemnation than any shout or accusation. He crumpled, the facade of his new life dissolving into the pathetic reality of his cowardice. She had not come for revenge. She had come for her own liberation. And as she turned her chair and wheeled herself out of that room, leaving him to face the wreckage he had made, she felt the last of his chains fall away. Jinwoo was waiting for her, his expression unchanged, but she saw in his eyes a deep, quiet pride. He said nothing, simply placed a hand on her shoulder for a brief moment, a gesture of profound solidarity. The storm was finally over. The aftermath was procedural, a series of legal and financial maneuvers that played out with a quiet, inexorable force. Marcus, stripped of his stolen assets and facing prosecution, accepted a plea deal that left him with nothing but a criminal record and the crushing weight of his own choices. Anika felt no triumph, no surge of victorious satisfaction. There was only a somber sense of closure, the feeling of a heavy book being closed for the last time. The justice was not in his punishment, but in her own freedom from the narrative he had tried to write for her. She was no longer his paralyzed wife, his victim, his liability. She was Anika, a woman who had faced the worst of human betrayal and had not only survived but was beginning to thrive. With the legal battles concluded, she found herself at a crossroads. The secure, quiet world of Jinwoo's apartment had been a necessary sanctuary, a cocoon for her metamorphosis. But she knew she could not stay there forever. The garden became her refuge. Jinwoo's building had a sprawling, hidden rooftop garden, a meticulously curated oasis of peace above the city's chaos. She spent her afternoons there, among the sculpted bonsai trees, the fragrant jasmine vines, and the quiet burble of a stone fountain. It was a space of deliberate growth, of patient cultivation, and it mirrored the healing taking place within her. It was in the garden that her relationship with Jinwoo deepened into something more profound than partnership. They would sit for hours, sometimes talking, sometimes in a comfortable silence that spoke more than words. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, he told her about his past. He spoke of a younger sister, lost years ago to a senseless act of violence, a tragedy that had hollowed him out and set him on his current path. He spoke of the burden of his world, the constant need for control and vigilance, the isolation it created. "I built walls," he said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on a gnarled, ancient pine, "to keep the chaos out. But I did not realize until you came that they were also keeping the light out." Anika listened, understanding the parallel grief that connected them. Both had lost their worlds, albeit in very different ways. Both had learned to navigate a life defined by that loss. She reached out and placed her hand over his. His skin was cool, his hand strong. It was a simple, instinctive gesture of comfort, but it was electric with unspoken emotion. "You gave me shelter from the storm," she said softly. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. "You," he said, his dark eyes meeting hers, full of a raw, unguarded tenderness she had never seen before, are the shelter. His world of shadows and power had been irrevocably changed by her quiet strength, and her world of loss and betrayal had been remade by his steadfast compassion. In the quiet solitude of the garden, surrounded by life they had both learned to tend, they found not just healing, but the fragile, beautiful beginnings of love. A love that was not born of passion and fire, but of stillness and strength, a love that promised not excitement, but peace. The months that followed were a period of quiet, purposeful rebuilding. The settlement from her divorce, which her lawyer had skillfully secured, provided Anika with a financial independence she had never known. But it was not the money that defined her new beginning, it was the purpose she found. She thought of that night in the rain, of the absolute terror and helplessness she had felt. She knew she was not the only one. How many others, disabled and vulnerable, had faced abandonment or abuse with nowhere to turn. The thought took root and grew, nurtured by her own experience and fostered by Jean Wu's quiet encouragement. She began to draft a plan. It started as a simple idea, a resource hotline. But with Jean Wu's strategic guidance and access to resources she could never have managed on her own, it evolved into something much larger. She envisioned a foundation, a sanctuary. It would be called the Shelter Project, a place that offered not just emergency housing but legal aid, counseling, and physical therapy for people with disabilities escaping domestic abuse. It was an ambitious, daunting project, but the work energized her. It gave her a reason to push harder in her sessions with Dr. Chen, a motivation that went beyond her own recovery. She was building strength not just for herself, but for the people she was determined to help. Jean Wu was her silent partner in every sense. He reviewed her business plans, connected her with architects and accountants from his own trusted circle, and provided the seed funding to turn her vision into a reality. He never tried to take over, always deferring to her decisions, his role that of a supportive consultant. His belief in her project was absolute. He saw it as a tangible manifestation of the resilience he so admired in her. His world, once defined by the cold calculus of power and debt, began to reorient around her mission of compassion and justice. He found a different kind of strength in helping her build rather than in controlling or commanding. Their love deepened in the shared work, in the late nights spent poring over blueprints and budgets, in the quiet satisfaction of watching her dream take shape. One afternoon, they visited the site of the first shelter, a former warehouse in a quiet part of the city that was being transformed into a state-of-the-art, accessible living facility. Anika, wearing a hard hat, wheeled herself through the cavernous, half-finished space, her eyes shining with excitement as she pointed out where the therapy rooms would be, where the community garden would grow. Jean Wu watched her, a small, rare smile touching his lips. He saw not a woman in a wheelchair, but a founder, a leader, a force of nature. He had rescued her from the rain, but she had rescued him from a life lived in the monochrome of solitude and duty. She had brought color, warmth, and purpose into his carefully controlled world. That evening, back in the rooftop garden as the sun set, he took her hand. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration. It was as quiet and profound as everything else between them. Anika, he said, his voice imbued with a deep, calm sincerity. "I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, not of sadness or grief, but of a joy so pure and overwhelming it felt like sunlight spreading through her chest. She had been thrown away, deemed worthless, and now, here was this man, this quiet, powerful, gentle man, offering her a lifetime. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes." Their wedding was not a grand affair. It was a reflection of their relationship, intimate, quiet, and deeply meaningful. It took place in the rooftop garden, the space that had been the backdrop for so much of their healing and the blossoming of their love. The late afternoon sun cast a soft, golden light over everything, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the bonsai trees. There were no crowds, only a handful of people who represented their new, carefully built world. Mrs. Kim was there, her eyes shining with joyful tears. Dr. Chen stood beside her, a proud, maternal smile on her face. A few of Jin Woo's most trusted men, including the silent driver who had been there on that first night, stood at a respectful distance, their formidable presence a testament to their loyalty. Anika wore a simple, elegant ivory dress, its lines clean and modern. Her hair was adorned with a single white gardenia, a nod to the first gift he had ever given her. Jin Woo wore a perfectly tailored dark suit, but he seemed softer, the hard edges of his usual demeanor smoothed away by the profound emotion of the moment. He stood waiting for her nod at an altar, but by the ancient, gnarled pine tree they both loved. As she wheeled herself down the stone path, her heart was full not with the nervous excitement of a typical bride, but with a deep, resonant peace. She looked at Jin Woo, at his steady, loving gaze, and saw her future. She saw a life of shared purpose, of quiet companionship, of unwavering support. She saw home. The vows they exchanged were not flowery or poetic. They were simple, direct promises spoken from the heart. He promised to be her partner, her advocate, and her quiet place in a loud world. She promised to be his light, his purpose, and his home. When he slid a simple, unadorned platinum band onto her finger, it felt less like a new beginning and more like a confirmation of what they had already become to each other. After the ceremony, they sat together on a bench overlooking the city, the lights beginning to twinkle on as dusk settled. They held hands, their fingers intertwined, a comfortable silence settling between them. The journey from that rainy driveway to this peaceful garden had been arduous, a path paved with betrayal, grief, and immense pain. But every step, every tear, every moment of struggle had led her here, to this man, to this life. She was no longer defined by what had been taken from her, the use of her legs, her marriage, her home. She was defined by what she had built, a foundation to help others, a life of purpose, and a love forged in the fires of adversity. The world teaches that great storms are to be feared, that they break and destroy. But sometimes, in the heart of the most devastating tempest, one can find an unexpected harbor. Sometimes, the things that are meant to shatter us instead reveal an unbreakable strength within. And sometimes, the person who finds us in the rain becomes the shelter we never knew we were searching for, a quiet, steady presence that promises not to stop the storm, but to hold our hand and walk with us until the sun comes out again. Anika looked at her husband, at the gentle strength in his face, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that her son had finally, truly risen.